You know, a few years ago when Dory and I started running, which, by the way, I haven't done in a while, in case you haven't noticed, but, you know, our first run together was going to be a half marathon, which is 13.1 miles. And when we started training for it, I had never run more than one, I think, consecutively. And at that time, I thought I was dying at the end of that. And so when we started running, there would be different places that I would get to, and I think there is absolutely no way I can ever run further than this. You know, how can I ever get 3 miles? You know, I can barely make 2 miles. And I would talk to people. Tasha was doing a lot of running at that time. Actually, she is now going to begin training for a 50-mile run in Grand Canyon. I think they run down to the bottom and then back to the top again. That's why they make mules, you know? Anyway. But anyhow, but I would talk to her because she had done a lot of reading about it. She ran with a lot of other people and stuff. And there were different times, you know, she could tell me that, you know, if you'll do this, it'll help you a little bit to get to that next level. And just, you know, the way you need to think about the things that can happen to your body and ways to avoid those. And so by having someone who has been there before and can tell you what to expect on the journey, that helps us be better equipped. Last week we saw Jesus, we looked at the beginning of his sending out of his disciples. He calls together the 12 to send them out on this missionary journey. And we began looking at his instructions for them last week in Matthew chapter 10. If you want to go ahead and open your Bibles, it's on page 688 in the Brown Pew Bibles. But we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 10, beginning in verse 16, as we see more of his instructions to the disciples. And I've titled the sermon this morning, Things to Know for the Journey, because Jesus just gives kind of a quick, this was going to happen, this is going to happen, be prepared for this. And he gives them some just quick, specific instructions to help them make sure that they get to the end of that journey. Now, as Daniel said with that song that we just sang, and I had never really paid that much attention to the words of the song, but it fits so perfectly as our prayer. Lord, it's not going to be an easy journey. Don't deliver me out of the tough parts, but be with me as I go through them. Help me to understand what to expect so that I can prepare myself for that. Because ultimately, the most important thing is that we finish the journey. You see, when we finish the journey, when we have done the will of our Father, that's when we enter into heaven. Jesus said earlier in Matthew that it's not just those who hear my words, but it's those who hear the words that I have said and put them into practice. And so that's our journey, is we go through life trying to put into practice the words that Jesus has said, the things that he has taught us to do. He healed the sick. He brought comfort. He recognized those who were in need, and he brought them the good news. And then he tells his disciples, now you go and do the same thing. That's what we're called to do every day of our life. But it's a tough journey, and so Jesus knows what it's going to be like, and so he gives his disciples some instructions. Matthew chapter 10, beginning in verse 16. The first thing that he points out to them, and he doesn't word it quite this way, but what he's telling them basically is to set your hearts and your minds for the journey. Now, what he says to the disciples in verse 16 is, I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore, be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. And I want to talk just a bit this morning about what shrewd means and what innocent means. Shrewd, by the way, does not mean rude. Okay? Everybody with me on that? To be shrewd doesn't mean to be rude. To be shrewd, and I'll read this definition that I got this week, means to react to difficult situations with a prudent, clear-headedness that carefully thinks through one's actions. prudent, clear-headedness that thinks through carefully one's actions. When I was, and I've shared this story before, when I was in college, I worked at a bar called Uncle Nasty's. It was not a good place to be working. This was back in my pagan days. And my grandparents, who I lived with, were very faithful Christians. And I know that it bothered them, the life that I was living, especially living it under their roof. And one night we were sitting at the dinner table, and I asked my grandfather, I said, Papa, can I go out to the lumber yard? He owned a lumber yard. And can I get some 2x4s because we want to mount the front end of a 57 Chevy on the wall in the bar. Now, he had lots of leftover 2x4s. It's not a big deal, but I thought it'd be nice for me to ask his permission. And I'll never forget, he just sat there for the longest time, eating his food, didn't say a word. Finally, I thought his silence must be permission. And so I went on about my meal, and then all of a sudden he said, no, can't do that. Don't agree with that. You see, that's shrewdness. He didn't just blurt out an answer, but he thought about it. The next thing that Jesus tells his disciples is to be as innocent as doves. And the word innocent, the word that's translated innocent in Greek actually means unmixed. It means a purity of motives, a singleness of mind. That you know what you stand for and you don't water that down. And that's what Jesus is telling his disciples to do. As you begin this journey, you need to set your hearts, you need to set your minds for the journey. You need to think clearly about what you're going to do and how you're going to react in certain situations. You don't react on emotions, but you think about it. And you make the best decision. And you do so because your heart and your mind are unmixed. You have a purpose. You have a goal. Later, Jesus gives them this goal in this way. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. Church, that is our mission. And Jesus says this needs to be unmixed in your life. Innocent as doves, shrewd as snakes. The next thing he says to his disciples is to be on your guard against men. And this is in verse 17. Be on your guard against men. They will hand you over to the local councils and flog you in their synagogues. Men are not always going to accept what you are about. And at some point in time, it may mean that you are even arrested. But then he goes on and says, but I want you to understand, you can take advantage of these situations. Verse 18, on my account, you will be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to the Gentiles. But when they arrest you, do not worry about what to say or how you will say it. At that time, you will be given what to say. For it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Now, he begins by saying these things that will happen to you. If you're arrested, if you're taken before the governors and the people, that ought to happen not because you're lawbreakers, not because you really are violent, rude people who go out there hurting other people, but it's on my account. These things happen to you because you're living this out, because you follow me, because you are my disciples. And then when you're brought before these people and to be judged, that is your opportunity to witness to them about me. Now, I know the disciples would have loved for Jesus to have said, I want you to watch out for men, because they're going to arrest you and take you in, and they'll flog you, and they're going to take you before governors and all this stuff. When that happens, you guys just pick up the phone and dial my number, and I'll come down and bail you out. But he doesn't say that. He says, when this happens, you are taken there as my witness. And don't worry about what you're going to say. It'll come to you. Boy, isn't that comforting to know? He goes on, confirming to them that they will be persecuted. And this persecution may be pretty serious. He says in verse 21, brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. All men will hate you because of me, but he who stands firm in the end, or to the end, will be saved. When you are persecuted in one place, flee to another. I tell you the truth, you will not finish going through the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Now, we're going to stop right there. Jesus says that families will betray families to death even. Earlier on, he says that they will be taken before governors and before the Gentiles. And these statements let us know that what Jesus is talking about here is not limited to this evangelism trip of the 12. This is something that's going to happen in the future. It tells us that Jesus' instructions here go out to the church. Because it was later when they were put to death for their faith. It was later that they were before Gentiles. Remember Jesus, when he sent them out, he said, I don't want you going to the Gentiles. And so we know that Jesus is talking about things that are going to happen later on, things that will happen in the church in the future. And he says it's going to be really bad. Notice in verse 22, he says, all men will hate you on account of me. That's kind of an exaggeration that Jesus makes there. Because not all men hated them. Some came to know the truth. But you know, have any of you ever felt like everybody is against me? Have any of you ever felt that way, or maybe even made that statement? Man, everybody is just beating up on me. Any of you relate to that? A couple of you? Okay. Next time you feel that way, call your mom. Because chances are your mom is never going to be that mad against you, and be against you like you think everybody else in the world. And so you exaggerate. You say everybody's against me. Jesus says that's how it's going to seem. But I want you to stand firm. When we get into our study of the book of Revelation, that is the key verse in that, is stand firm. It's going to look bad. It's going to seem bad. It's going to feel bad. But I want you to stand firm. Stand firm because you are of one mind and it's unmixed. And you're resolutely thinking through what you're going to do. And he tells them to keep on going. There's kind of an urgency that seems to come out in here. Nothing is supposed to stop them. If people are persecuting you in one city, don't just stand there in that city and bog down and waste your time there. You move on to someplace else. They're going to persecute you? Yes. Well, there's going to be people that persecute you in the next town too, so why not move over there and get a new flavor of persecution? Keep moving, because this is important. And he makes this statement that you're not going to finish getting through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes, and that people debate on what that time frame is that Jesus is talking about. Some people say that he's talking about the second coming, and that the disciples aren't going to make it around everywhere before his second coming, his return, which it's been about 2,000 years now we're waiting. There's not many places in the world that we haven't been with the gospel. There are still some. And so that could be what he's talking to, but it also could be that he's talking about in Daniel chapter 7, verse 13, you can turn there if you want to, page 631. Daniel is having a vision, and he's called up into the heavens, and he says that he sees one like the Son of Man coming to the throne. Now, if you're in heaven and you see someone coming, which direction are they going? Up. And so this may be referring to Jesus' ascension. He may be letting these disciples know the time is urgent because I'm not going to be here physically with you much longer. And therefore, you need to keep going. You need to not give up when you're persecuted. You need to keep spreading the word. And then he says also in verse 24 and 25, he says, a student is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for the student to be like his teacher and the servant like his master. If the head of the house has been called Beelzebub, how much more the members of his household? Jesus tells them, you're even going to be called the devil, of the devil. And he says, but it happens to me too. He's not calling the disciples to do anything that he didn't do, anything that he wouldn't do, anything that he hadn't experienced. You will be persecuted. But then he says, but don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Then he throws in a be afraid. And then he says, don't be afraid. One of the commentaries that I'm reading, and I'm trying to remember the author's name now, can't remember it, but he said that the most frequent command given in the Gospels by Jesus is don't be afraid. I haven't gone back and looked that up yet and counted them all, but I think there may be something to that. Beginning in verse 26, Jesus says, so don't be afraid of them. And he's talking about those who will call you Beelzebub. So don't be afraid of them. There's nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What I tell you in the dark, speak in the light. What is whispered in your ear, proclaim from the rooftops. Why aren't they to be afraid? They're not to be afraid because even though people accuse them of being of Beelzebub, at some point it's going to be made known that they are not of Beelzebub. They are of Jesus Christ. You see, people will mock you and ridicule you for doing the right thing. They'll make all kinds of accusations. But if you stand firm and set in your mind as to what you are about and who you are, and you walk faithfully with that, at some point it's going to be revealed who you truly are. So don't be afraid. Verse 28, he says, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Don't be afraid of men. Yes, they might kill your body, but if you live in the kingdom of God, if you belong to Christ, your body may die, but your soul will still live. So don't be afraid of those who can kill the body. That's really comforting, to know that somebody called you one day. Say the elders call you in one day and they said, hey, we want you to go to over to Chicago. And we want you to begin a missionary work in the inner city of Chicago. And you know what? Don't be afraid of the guys with the guns. Don't be afraid of their bullets. It's okay. If they shoot you, that's okay. Wouldn't that just make you feel confident? Yeah, that's exactly what Jesus says to his disciples here. Don't be afraid of those who can kill the body. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Now, there's discussion and debate among the scholars as to who Jesus is referring to here. Some say that he's referring to God. We need to fear God because God has ultimate control over both our body and our soul, and he can wipe both of them out. And is that true? Amen. And if that fear of God in that way motivates you to be faithful and continue in your journey and to continue to witness to people, then hang on to that. But others say that what Jesus is referring to here is be afraid of the one who can lure you away from your steadfast journey and persecute you enough that before long you give up on your faith and you walk away from the task that God has called you to, and you get weak in your faith, and therefore you will lose your body and you will lose your soul. So whether it be God that we must fear, or whether it be Satan that we must fear, what Jesus is saying is you do need to have some fear that you may not make it to heaven if you don't continue steadfast in what He called you to do. And then the reason I think that He's speaking more about Satan there is the one we ought to fear is because the very last thing He says here in verse 31, or excuse me, in verse 29, He says, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from the will of your Father. And even the very hairs of your head are numbered. So don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows." Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid because God knows you intimately. He loves you intimately. He cares for you intimately. Do you think He's ever going to abandon you? Do you think He's ever going to just give up and walk away from you in the middle of hard times? He knows how many hairs you have on your head. Or, Jerry, as many as you used to have on your head. And He knows where they all went. I hope you know I'm picking on you because for some of us, I told somebody the other day, I said, maybe God's running out of numbers and that's why some of us are getting a little thinner on top. So He has to count for the young kids or something. But if we take everything that Jesus has said here, and I want to kind of wrap this up and tie it up into a bundle. He begins by saying, set your minds and your hearts for your journey. Be shrewd. React to difficult situations in a prudent clear-headedness that carefully thinks through your decisions. You don't react out of emotion and just fly off the handle, but you think about what you're doing and the decisions that you're making. And then be innocent, literally of unmixed, an undivided loyalty, a purity of intention to do what is right. And I want you to think about these 2 things this morning. And I want you to ask yourself, is my life undivided? Or am I split in several different directions? Is my task in life, is my goal in life undivided? Unmixed? And if it's not, we need to reconsider some of our priorities. And the second thing I want to ask you is, when you're faced with a difficult decision, do you think it all through or do you react out of your emotion? When people challenge your faith, when they question your faith, when you're trying to tell someone about Jesus Christ and they begin mocking you and laughing at you. And by the way, we're going to talk a lot about this tonight in our sermon and out of Proverbs. And I really want to encourage all of you to be back for that because it's going to be an awesome lesson that I think we all need to know. But when you are trying to share your faith with people and they come against you, do you think through what you're going to say, or do you just get mad? And if that's the way you handle it, we need to be making some changes this morning. Because this is the first way we need to be, with our hearts and our minds set on who we are and what we are about. That's how Jesus begins His instructions. But then He wraps it up by saying, and don't be afraid, because 2 sparrows are sold for a penny, which means how much are sparrows worth? Not much. Why are they not worth much? Because there's so many of them. They're everywhere. And yet not one of all those millions and billions of sparrows, not one of them falls to the ground without God knowing about it. And if He cares that much about a little bitty worthless sparrow, what do you think He thinks about you, who were created in His image? He sent His Son to die for. You are worth more than many, many, many sparrows. So don't be afraid. When you set your mind and your heart to do what God has called you, to walk the path, to walk that journey, to go out and spread His good news into the world, you're going to run into some obstacles, but don't be afraid, because He is with you. And He loves you. And He will never forsake you. I think, church, it's often what happens a lot of times is that we begin the journey and we're doing well for a while, but after a period of time, we get tired. And we don't always see the fruits right away. And we get some objections and some persecutions. We may lose some friends. We may lose some family members. And after a while, we kind of want to just circle the wagons and say, you know what? I just want to take care of what I got here. And so we begin to get mixed minds. And sometimes we need to be called back to the point where we say, we need to totally commit our lives to what God has called us to do. And so this morning, I want to encourage you to recommit your life to the journey that Christ has set us apart for. To make sure that our minds are focused on this and this alone. To make sure that we pursue wisdom enough that we can handle tough situations in a shrewd way rather than just going off the handle. And to make sure that we live as if God really does care for us and is with us as we go about this journey. And if you're here this morning and you need to recommit your life, you need to say, you know, I need to be doing what God has called me to do. I've been letting fear and emotion and everything else get in the way for so long, and I need to trust. God does love me. He is with me. And I need to not be afraid anymore. Or maybe you're here this morning and you've never accepted Christ in the first place. And this morning you need to do that. Whatever need you have, we invite you to come forward while we stand and sing this song.